My name is Duncan Shaw. I work at the University of Manchester in the UK, and with Andrew McClelland, we are trying to bring together a whole group of people who are interested in societal resilience from across the world and give them a space to talk about their national practices, the things that they do well, and there is so much that's being done well across the world. The things that they have some struggles with, and so we share experiences in different ways. We talk about societal resilience, about the things that they're doing, and we can all learn from that. This webinar was because we had a number of conversations and were listening to some of the good practices that were happening in different places. And Frances kindly said that she would be willing to be our first, second maybe, speaker on the things that have been going on in South Africa. A few months ago, we had speakers from New Zealand talking about the work that they had been doing. And we have, as you can see on the map here, we have a whole range of different people who are interested from different countries, again, bringing their experiences. If you're interested in the International Consortium, then the website is in the very top corner of this slide, or just Google INCSR with a dash in it. Of course, you can email us, and the email address is on this slide as well. The International Consortium began based on some of our work on the National Consortium. So we run the National Consortium in the UK, and NCSR has done a whole series of webinars over the last 4 or 5 years. And you can look back at those webinars if you wish by looking on YouTube, just for NCSR. There may be 20, 25 webinars on there. We also have a range of free practitioner modules if you wish to look at the sorts of work that we've been doing. We have a strategy and manual for societal resilience that is applicable to any country. It's a generic manual. We're turning that into the international standard. We're doing that at the moment, and so that will come out through the International Standards Organisation in due course. We have modules 1, 2 and 3, community emergency hubs based on some of the excellent work that's been done in New Zealand, spontaneous volunteers based on some of the work we did with the UK government a number of years ago, and essential services for vulnerable people based on some of the work we were doing in Cleveland and in the north of England. We're currently working on civil society, looking at civil society as a capability, and so that module will be coming out in the next 6 months or so. If you're international, if you wish to join the International Consortium, then send us an email or join us on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is where we will be putting all of our notifications on future events and the sorts of things that the International Consortium will be getting up to. If you think that your country has some excellent practice and you want to share that, then please tell us about it. Please let us know. We have a whole series of events planned, but if you feel confident and you want to talk about the work you've been doing or the struggles that you have in a webinar, then please do. Please get in touch with us and let us know all about that. I still hear lots of pings happening. It looks like we're up to about 130 people. Those pings will keep happening as people keep joining. So hopefully they're not disturbing to you. One of the other things that we do in the UK is run a conference on societal resilience. The conference will be 24th and 25th of February 2026. It will be held at the University of Manchester. You're all invited. We will hopefully exceed the number of people who we've had over the last few years. So in 2022, 140 people, then the year after 180, the year after that 170 people, all getting together. Roughly, it's around 60% are government, 20%, maybe slightly more, is the voluntary sector, and around 20% being consultants, academics, and so forth. So this is very much a practitioner-based conference, looking to talk about really important topics for that community. If you wish to register, the link is on the slide, and we'll be continuing the conversation around civil society. So looking at how do civil society get involved in societal resilience, the voluntary sector, community groups, the groups right at the grassroots of society, how can they get themselves involved? Children, young people, how can they be involved? And thinking about families and intergenerational communities and all coming together, again, to think about societal resilience. So if this is something that interests you, then come and join us in February in Manchester. There is no planned online joining at the moment. We think that to build resilience, it's really important to get together, to meet each other, to talk to people, and it's best doing that in person. We do a whole series of webinars during the year that allow us the online community to flourish, and this is an example of that. So it will be an in-person conference. So, as I said at the very beginning, but for those of you who have just joined, I'm Duncan Shaw from the University of Manchester, and Francis, I'm delighted that Francis, maybe you could come on camera, Francis, if you're able. I'm delighted to introduce Francis as our first speaker of the conference, at this webinar. Francis is Chief Exec of NPC DMS in South Africa. Francis, we met at the conference for the first time, and it was delightful having you there. I'm so pleased that you're able to deliver this webinar. Maybe you could, while I'm just giving you a quick intro, Francis, you could share your slides so you're not trying to do two things at once. Excellent, there we go. So, Francis, we met at the conference, but I said that I would let you give a little introduction to yourself so that you could tell people about you, the most relevant things about you, based on the role of the private sector and their contribution in disaster risk reduction. Francis, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thanks,
Thank you so much for the webinar. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Duncan. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you very much for this platform. I feel very privileged to be the first of the webinar series. It's a little bit of pressure because I feel like I have to set a bar, but really honored to be here, and I'm so excited to see all the different participants who've taken the time to come and hear us out. I mean, I see Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Kenya, Northern Ireland. It's wonderful. Really, I wish I could meet you all in person, but hopefully we shall do so at future events. Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Frances Hoets, representing DMS NPC. We're a nonprofit company that's been in the disaster management game since 1999. We've largely focused, in the public sector, interestingly enough. So we've developed all of our tools and knowledge and skills and so on through a lot of engagement and support within the public sector. But recently, well, I suppose, let me say in the last 5 years, we find ourselves uniquely positioned as a nonprofit company, sort of bridging the gap between the public sector and the private sector. And in doing so, learning more about how the private sector can really sit at the disaster risk reduction table. And through recent discussions we actually had, we hosted a solution summit here in South Africa. And one of the big needs that actually emerged out of that was the fact that the issue around jargon, in fact, and disaster risk reduction. Disaster risk management is often perceived as something that sits very much in the public sector. That's the role of government or civil society organizations. Whereas the private sector are very much more focused on enterprise risk management, business continuity planning, and so on. So we thought, out of the Solution Summit, there was this need emerged to try to put together a webinar or a series around bringing awareness to disaster risk reduction, but within the context of the private sector. So helping to bridge this sort of jargon gap as well in terms of better understanding what is disaster risk reduction within the private sector, what is the specific role within the different spheres that the private sector can play, and also using the opportunity for our organization, DMS, to come and share some of our best practices that we've had the privilege of being involved in the last few years, on the ground, working with the private sector to not only support the organization itself, but also its immediate environment, in terms of, communities that surround it, ultimately working towards enhancing societal resilience. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. I do have a MPhil, master's in disaster risk science. Disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction is my absolute passion. I can talk about it for days. And yeah, I'm just one of those people that's certainly very privileged to be working in a field that I'm super passionate about. All right, so without further ado, some of you might be wondering, am I in the right room? What on earth is disaster risk reduction? And how on earth does this impact the private sector? So first of all, you're in the right room, you're in the right place. In South Africa, where I'm based, the phrase that's often repeated is the fact that disaster risk reduction is everybody's business. So whether you come from the private sector or an NGO or a government agency, we all need to take a closer look at how and why, whether we are from the private sector or whatever role we're playing, how we should be involved in basically enhancing societal resilience, especially within a world that is so dynamic, with so many different macro forces at play, whether it's climate change, population growth, population migration, and also the general state of the economy. These have all got have huge roles to play in terms of how it brings risk to our doorstep and how we should be managing it, and looking at external risk, not only focusing on the risk that we look at internally. So before I get into the nitty-gritty, I would like to set the scene of a major disaster that happened here in South Africa in 2022. It was in April. Major flood occurred in one of our provinces called KwaZulu-Natal, KZN, in South Africa, which was basically considered one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in the province's history at that point. It was triggered by an intense low-pressure system, which brought extreme rainfall with coastal areas like Durban, the major city, recording between 200 and 400 millimeters of rain within a 24-hour period. This led to widespread flooding, mudslides, and infrastructure collapse, with this disaster claiming at least 436 lives, displacing over 40,000 people and destroying thousands of homes and causing major economic losses, estimated at over $2 billion or 30 billion rand. Critical infrastructure, including roads, power lines, and ports, were severely damaged, exacerbating recovery challenges. And because of the extent of the damage and the impact, the national government, through Disaster Management Center, declared this a national state of disaster. So bringing it into the private sector focus, in this scenario, even Toyota, an anchor of KZN industry and employment, could not control the weather in this circumstance. This extreme flood event represented Toyota's most severe production disruption in South Africa, causing the fall of sales by 40%, largely due to supply disruption, with a total production disruption of 45,000 units estimated. The Motor Industry Staff Association noted that the devastating impacts this flood event would have on the retail motor industry, which was still battling to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, which was further exacerbated by imports and export delays because of the disruptions that were also occurring at the port of Durban. So this, as I say, I just want to set the scene, and I'm going to be referring to this disaster as I go through some of my slides as an opportunity to bring into focus, as I say, the role of the private sector within disaster risk reduction. But basically, this disasters like this one that I've just described are going to keep coming, and they are likely to become more severe and more frequent in their occurrence. And they will impact large corporates and their supply chains, as well as enterprises that we refer to as SMMEs, which are your small, micro, and medium enterprises. Just as they would impact communities, governments, as well as NGOs. So something has to change. There needs to be a shift in mindset if we're going to solve this problem as a collective, particularly given the diminishing return or resources within an overburdened public sector. I mean, I'm speaking for South Africa, but I'm certain in many other countries, one could probably say the same thing. And the public sector is the sector has been traditionally responsible for planning for and responding to these type of impacts. But we're finding that they are less and less likely able to do so because of their diminishing resources within that sector. And so they are less able to proactively manage risk, and at least at minimum, they're able to just assist with response and recovery and adopt very much a reactive approach, which I'm sure everybody can agree is a very unsustainable one, specifically when we talking about the private sector, around economic growth, and also sustainable development at large. So let's take a closer look at what we mean by disaster risk reduction. Essentially, it's a systematic development and application of policies, strategies, and practices to minimize vulnerabilities and disaster risks throughout society to attempt to prevent or avoid or mitigate or what we call limit or prepare for adverse impacts of hazards within the broader context of sustainable development. Now, we keep emphasizing the issue around sustainable development because we found in a lot of the work that we're doing, especially within the South African context, but we've seen it through research done elsewhere internationally, is that disaster management or disaster risk reduction is often misconstrued as a response function. And so there's often a lot of emphasis and investment focusing more about how best to respond, provide relief, and also recover from a disaster, with often very little investment in the proactive side of disaster risk reduction, which focuses more on prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. And once you start shifting your focus towards that proactive side of disaster risk reduction, you are starting to look at supporting development and ensuring it becomes more sustainable and also enhancing resilience within that space. Essentially, protecting development, protecting the economic growth of the area, and so on and so on. So while the term disaster risk reduction, it sounds like it implies proactive reduction of risk through prevention, mitigation, preparedness, it also does apply to response and recovery. So we're not saying that we shouldn't focus on response and recovery. Obviously, that is necessary, especially when we talk about hazards of natural origin, where we can't prevent them. They're going to happen regardless, but it's about how well do we prepare for them. So essentially, we also need to ensure that the principle of disaster risk reduction is upheld during response efforts, ensuring that the impacts are actively mitigated through appropriate response measures, while recovery efforts should be done in such a way as to build back better, to ensure that the impacts are either avoided in the future or at least reduced. So I always give the example of, whenever a bridge is washed away, we're not going to go back and build the same bridge in the same place with the same building material at the same height, because clearly it was washed away for a reason. So we need to learn from the lessons that the disaster presented to us and make adjustments and corrective actions so as to avoid it or at least reduce it from happening should the next flood event occur. But how does this apply to the private sector? I think a lot of people assume that, well, this is the role of government, this is the role of NGOs and nonprofits and the like. Where does private sector play a role in this sort of disaster risk reduction continuum, as we refer to it? So there are basically three roles that where the private sector can play a role, play in strengthening disaster risk reduction. This is through investment, innovation, and collaboration. So when we talk about investment, this is where the private sector can fund, for example, infrastructure improvements such as resilient buildings, early warning systems, can mitigate disaster impacts by doing so. So by investing in risk assessments and sustainable practices, businesses ensure continuity and protect economic assets, benefiting both themselves as well as the community at large. So you recall earlier I've been talking about the fact that the public sector is really suffering from a reduced resource base over time, which in many cases, and I can speak for South Africa again, we are seeing the private sector taking more and more steps towards covering the gap of those resource gaps to actively play a role in risk reduction. So that investment from the private sector will really go a long way, especially we've seen, for example, around the development and implementation of early warning systems to ensure not only the protection of the organization, but its employees, its customer base, and so on and so on. The second one is innovation. Private companies drive technological advancements like developing AI-powered predictive models, satellite monitoring, or durable materials for disaster-resistant structures. These innovations enhance preparedness, response, and recovery, basically enabling faster and more effective disaster management. And then finally, collaboration. And this is the role that we find ourselves more and more part of. This is where the private sector partners with governments, NGOs, and communities to share resources, expertise, and data. So through public-private partnerships, businesses contribute to coordinated disaster planning, response efforts, and recovery initiatives, fostering resilient ecosystems and leveraging collective strengths in the process. So it's a very exciting space that we can find ourselves in at the moment. I'll give you a quick example where DMS, we've been working in the mining sector around developing community-based early warning systems, which was part of actually achieving the mine's mandate of ensuring adequate emergency plans are in place for its site-induced emergencies like tailings dam failure and so on. But in the process, by working with us and bringing the public sector into the table, we were not only able to assist the company to comply with various frameworks and standards, but in the process, we're able to really touch the community in such a way as to enhance community resilience, not only to the site-induced emergencies, but also to general hazards and so on that they're exposed to on a day-to-day basis, because they've been empowered with knowledge, tools, and skills in the process. So it was really a great example of where the private sector can play a significant role in investing in a program, providing an innovation and resources, and then obviously by fostering collaboration, able to really bring all the different stakeholders together to enhance community resilience in that space. All right, so the private sector, it comprises businesses and organizations driven by profit motives, and they operate within three interconnected spheres. And I'm sure many of you work within this framework or very familiar with it. But for those of you who may not be, when the different spheres include your sort of micro environment, which involves the organization itself. Then there's the market or task environment, which addresses the immediate sort of external factors. And then you've got your broader external forces, which we refer to as our macro environment. And this is where your different thematic areas include political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental factors that need to be brought into consideration in terms of the organization, but at this sort of broader scale. So these spheres influence strategic decision-making, operations, and long-term sustainability. So using this model, I'll be discussing how disaster risk reduction can be integrated and applied in each of these spheres, and in doing so, unpack the role that the private sector plays both internally and externally when it comes to disaster risk reduction. And I will be referring back to the disaster that I've already explained and elaborated on, the flood event that impacted on the Toyota plant in the KwaZulu-Natal province of South Africa. All right. So we'll start with the microenvironment, the organization itself. So obviously this sphere encompasses your internal factors like company culture, resources, employees, and management structures that directly shape a business's operations and strategic decisions. So disaster risk reduction integrates into the organization itself by embedding risk management into core business, operations, resources, and culture. So this involves proactive measures to protect assets, employees, and processes from disruptions caused by disasters such as floods, earthquakes, wildfires, civil unrest, sinkholes, you name it. So the organization tries to better protect and control its microenvironment over which it has direct control, but also tries to influence the market and macro environment when it starts taking disaster risk reduction a lot more seriously. So in terms of the context of the flood, what does this look like? So we said that Toyota suffered, basically Toyota within its sort of micro environment as a result of the flood, suffered significant damage. So that included your physical damage, where approximately 4,000 vehicles were waterlogged and damaged beyond repair, excessive destruction to electrical systems, mechanical equipment, IT infrastructure, and production lines across the site. Floodwaters inundated the facility, leading to corrosion, contamination, and operational shutdown. So that was just from a physical damage perspective. Then you look at the operational disruption. So production halted immediately with the plant offline for several months. And as a result, the company faced supply chain interruptions, including delays in parts of local suppliers and logistics via Durban's port. The floods also, as I mentioned before, exacerbated existing challenges from COVID-19, stalling the recovery efforts. Then one can also unpack the financial losses, which, as I already alluded to earlier, had basically contributed to the province's overall economic toll. The events led to lost revenue from halted manufacturing and scrapped inventory. Right, so this was a significant impact on one production plant. So I wanted to maybe pause for a moment and ask the audience the question here now is, given what I've just unpacked from an organizational microenvironment perspective and the kind of impacts that I've already now described, what DRR measures could the organization have applied internally to prevent, mitigate, or prepare for this type of flood event? Now, obviously, I'm not expecting everybody to be familiar with the vehicle industry and plant production and so on. But I think from a general perspective, from a private sector perspective, understanding the physical, operational, financial, and other losses in this type of flood event, possibly if you don't mind just scanning that QR code, I hope it works. This is a Mentimeter. I'm still learning how to use the Mentimeter. If you don't mind scanning that code and popping in some suggestions of how you think the company could have prevented, mitigated, or at least prepared for this type of flood event. Great, I've got some answers coming through. The first one is flood defenses, BCP, which I'm assuming is business continuity planning, pumping solutions, early warning system, fantastic. Backup power, absolutely, especially in South Africa. I don't know how many of you are aware of the fact that we have regular load shedding. Let's see, site establishments, employee support, fantastic examples. Historical flooding data, great. That's obviously understanding where you're located, especially within the floodplain. If you are within a floodplain, 1 in 20, 1 in 50, 1 in 100-year flood, understanding the trends. So this is actually very important, where as a company you need to understand, for example, the history in terms of what are the historic trends when it comes to flooding, but then you've got to actually really overlay that with climate change projections, because with the advent of climate change, things aren't how they normally should be, unfortunately. So we'll start to see a lot more frequency and intensity of these type of events, for example, and that needs to factor into your flood defense planning, flood risk management planning. Many more here. Forecasting, actions on warnings, have and use action plan. Actions on warning, employee support, employee well-being support, training and mock drills. Fantastic. That is certainly something that I think traditionally companies focus a lot on about fire drills, which is fires that could occur internally, for example. And so it would be a good idea to extend those drills to accommodate your external factors, such as severe weather events, earthquakes, sinkholes, and the like. Thank you so much. There's some lovely, some great examples coming through here. A lot of them pointing towards early warning systems, drills, training, insurance, also very good. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go into the other spheres. I'm certain what I will do is make sure that we get a snapshot of this. Sorry, with the way I'm sharing right now, it's not easy for me to show you exactly what it looks like, but I'm sure Duncan and Andrew will allow us to share this screenshot of the outcomes of your suggestions following the webinar along with this presentation. But thank you very much. Some fantastic examples here. And also, sorry, let me just go on to the chat, but I can see that there's been some pointers there as well. Let's see. Offsite plans with community, fantastic. Building back better post-disaster recovery. That's also an interesting point, is a lot of companies, especially when it comes to sort of external disasters impacting on a company, these sort of pre-disaster recovery planning efforts are absolutely critical. Understanding what, for example, government is responsible for, understanding, especially if your customers or communities or employees are being affected, who's going to provide the relief, the temporary housing, and who's going to assist with the reestablishment of critical services by restoring critical infrastructure, because all of this will have an impact on the continuity of the business and ensuring your employees get back to work as quickly as possible as well. And then, of course, what role the company can play in those recovery activities as well. Fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing. All right, so I'm going to move on to the lessons learned within this. Remember the micro environment. So basically, the plant was overwhelmed in just 45 minutes, essentially, during this event, revealing gaps in early warning and rapid response systems. So as many of you have indicated here, one of the key lessons is definitely ensuring a much better early warning system, coupled with a rapid response system, recognizing the need for multi-layered contingency plan and not just operational continuity. The first recovery priority was safety and welfare of employees, followed by community and operations. So this people-first approach builds trust and morale, which proved essential during the 16-week shutdown that the plant was exposed to or experienced. Also, the Toyota Motor Corporation in Japan responded immediately with personnel, equipment, and parts, proving that strong global networks and a unified corporate culture can really accelerate recovery in this type of circumstance. And then the slogan, driving recovery was better than before, similar to the term I introduced earlier, building back better, which inspired teams to rebuild not just quickly, but smarter and stronger in order to try to prevent this occurrence from obviously happening again in the future. All right, so now we're moving to sort of the market environment, market or task environment, which addresses your more immediate external factors. So this includes external stakeholders such as your customers, suppliers, competitors, and regulators that directly interact with the business, influencing its day-to-day operations, as well as market strategies. So when it comes to back to our disaster scenario and what this means within that space, the impact of the flood in the market environment for the Toyota company or production plant, it had an impact to its customers as floods disrupted vehicle supply, directly impacting customers who rely on the company's popular models such as your Toyota Hilux, Quantum, and the like. Production halted on April 12, 2022, leading to delayed deliveries and shortage of vehicles in the market. So this caused customer dissatisfaction, with reports of backlogs extending months, particularly affecting fleet operators and individual buyers within the market. And then in terms of what the company did in terms of DRR measures, it mitigated this by rerouting some production to other facilities, though at reduced capacity and offering compensation or priority scheduling to loyal customers, preserving brand trust in the process. The impact was also felt with suppliers. The plant supply chain, reliant on local and regional suppliers for parts and materials, faced severe disruptions. The flooding damaged infrastructure, including roads, the Durban port, delaying the delivery of critical components from suppliers in KwaZulu-Natal and beyond. And of course, also a mudslide inundated the plant, further complicating logistics as supplier access was blocked for weeks. Again, Toyota attempted disaster risk reduction in the process by working to diversify its supplier network and negotiating temporary agreements with alternative vendors. But the initial supply chain bottleneck contributed to a 5-month production halt, which basically highlighted vulnerabilities in dependency on local micro-environmental partners. Then within this sphere, competitors were also affected. So the disaster created a competitive dynamic within the automotive sector, with other competitors like your VW, Ford, and so on, who experienced less severe damage to their operations, gaining temporary market advantage by meeting the demand that Toyota couldn't fulfill. So this shift pressured Toyota to expedite recovery to regain market share, particularly within the pickup truck segment, which dominated the market at the time. However, the industry-wide supply chain strain also leveled the playing field at some point anyway, prompting some collaboration among competitors to share resources and stabilize the market, benefiting Toyota's long-term recovery. And then also the other impacts was felt with what is called publics within this sphere, which includes your local communities, media, and regulatory bodies, which form part of the affected publics. So the floods stranded Toyota employees and displaced nearby residents, drawing media attention to the plant's vulnerability and raising questions basically about raising questions about the corporate responsibility of the company. So public pressure mounted for Toyota to support community recovery, which it addressed through employee assistance programs and donations and so on. So again, this brings back the importance of your pre-disaster recovery planning for any corporate really, in order to anticipate the need to support not only the organization's recovery, but also the surrounding community's recovery, rather than having to deal with a PR nightmare during the disaster while trying to attempt to recover one's own operations in the process. So the lessons learned here is that the floods exposed interconnected vulnerabilities within Toyota's microenvironment, amplifying the need for resilient strategies. The prolonged shutdown disrupted stakeholder relationships with the ripple effects on customer loyalty, supply reliability, and so on. And Toyota's response, including stakeholder communication and adaptive logistics, helped to mitigate some damage, but the event underscored the importance of preemptive risk management with micro-environmental partners. So there was a lot of work that could have been done, and I'm certain that the company will be doing going forward, whether it's for floods or any type of hazards that they might be exposed to. Toyota also prioritized support for its local suppliers and dealers, recognizing their vulnerability to disruptions, thus underscoring the importance of extending disaster risk reduction to the entire value chain, not just core operations. And this has been an interesting conversation that's also come up recently about, for example, the role of what we call the big brother corporates, who are reliant on, your SMMEs within the supply chain or value chain. So your small, micro, and medium enterprises that make up your value chain or supply chain need protection, because often they don't have the necessary resources, skills, or know-how to be able to implement it themselves. So not only will the big corporate be protecting itself by protecting its value chain in investing disaster risk reduction across there, it will also go a long way to be seen to be investing in overall societal resilience by assisting in protecting the smaller micro and medium enterprises in the process. All right, then we move into the final sphere, which is your macro environment. As I said before, this is your broader external forces. So this sphere involves your larger societal forces like economic trends, technological advancements, political regulations, and environmental factors that impact the business's long-term sustainable and strategic planning. So in terms of our disaster scenario, what does that look like? Basically, the impact of this flood on the macro environment of Toyota in South Africa included economic losses, so an economic impact, which were felt as the flood disrupted South Africa's automotive sector, a key economic contributor, leading to reduced GDP growth, job losses, and so on. Export markets reliant on the port experienced delays, affecting Toyota's global supply chain and prompting economic instability in trade-dependent regions. There was also an interesting political impact because this disaster exposed governance weaknesses, with Toyota and other businesses criticizing the provincial government, as well as the metropolitan municipality for inadequate flood defenses and infrastructure maintenance. So what happened is that this led to heightened political pressure for accountability, culminating in Toyota's June 2025 lawsuit against these entities and Transnet. So the event spurred calls for public-private partnerships to enhance resilience, with Toyota engaging in dialogues to influence policy reforms. Politically, the floods basically shifted focus towards climate adaptation funding, impacting Toyota's long-term planning and reliance on government support. Then from a technological perspective, the floods also highlighted the need for technological innovation in disaster mitigation. Toyota invested in advanced tools like GIS mapping and probabilistic modeling to assess future risk at its plant, enhancing its technological resilience, which, as many of you also indicated, would support early warning systems and the like. Then there was also the environmental impact. So the floods linked to climate change underscored environmental risks to Toyota's operations in a low-lying industrial zone. So the mudslide that buried the plant emphasized the need for sustainable site planning and climate adaptation. Toyota responded by integrating environmental risk assessments into its strategy, investing in flood-resistant infrastructure and aligning with global sustainability goals. So the event also heightened awareness of environmental regulations, influencing Toyota's long-term environmental footprint and macro-environmental strategy in the end. So yeah, the last Mentimeter for the group. So now the one before we focus very much on the organization. So I'm now asking you to look at the much broader scale. What DRR measures could the organization have applied, supported, or invested in the macro environment to prevent, mitigate, or prepare for this type of flood event? Now, I'm specifically asking this question because it's not very often that the organizations look beyond its sort of micro as well as your market space when it comes to disaster risk reduction. When at the macro level, this is often where corporates or other organizations will rely very heavily on the public sector and civil society organizations to basically, fund, invest, plan for these the factors that reside within the macro sphere, which I will show you, remind you what it entails again: political, economic, social, technological, and the like. So if you can please scan the QR code, then I can be able to see your answers, which I'm hoping. I don't know if anybody has seen. Oh, here we go. Oh, I see. You know what has happened is, I told you I'm not used to Mentimeter. I actually showed you the second slide before the first slide. So I'm going to, there we go. If you can please just start putting it in now. Even though it may say the micro environment, just answer as if you're speaking to the macro environment, if you don't mind. So if you can scan the QR code, let's see if that works. Focus on the question on the screen, which relates to how the company could have applied, supported, or invested in the macro environment to prevent, mitigate, or prepare for this flood event. Thank you. Knowledge sharing. I like that. I was actually recently involved with something called a community of practice within the mining sector. And this brought individuals from different countries to come and share lessons learned and best practices around tailings dam failure, in fact, about what organizations could have done before, during, and after to prevent or mitigate or prepare for that event. And it was such an impactful event, that sort of knowledge sharing. To be able to, even if it comes from different contexts and occurrences, it was such an easy way to be able to integrate risk reduction into one's own planning. All right, lobbying with government. Thank you. Capacity development, past history, partnering with local government, flood awareness, helping community resilience, plan with other agencies. So that comes with, as mentioned before, collaboration, public-private partnerships, contribute to policy, plan ahead. Great. Thank you very much. These are fantastic examples. And I think really one of the, as I mentioned before, companies or organizations that are willing to share mistakes or gaps and lessons that they've learned with other key players within their own industry really go a long way to not only learning from their own mistakes, but or not mistakes necessarily, but being able to apply corrective actions, but also to be able to assist with other organizations to avoid doing the same for future events. And also on the chat, I see promote or engage with political programs to support disaster risk reduction. Fantastic. Thank you very much. All right. So the lessons learned from this exercise through particularly with the Toyota experience in the flood, is that the fact that flood exposes systemic vulnerabilities, economic fragility, political inaction, legal uncertainties, technological gaps, and environmental threats. The company's recovery, marked by partial production resumption by September and full capacity by early 2023, relied on navigating these factors through advocacy, innovation, and legal action, all are within this sort of macro sphere. Toyota also worked with KZN authorities to rebuild roads and relocate overhead cables underground, highlighting the importance of public-private partnerships for infrastructure resilience. Toyota also invested millions in flood mitigation across multiple levels, So future-proofing the site using a layered defense system. So this included city infrastructure, including road and cable restoration, facility perimeter, including canals and stormwater upgrades, as well as early warning systems. And then internally, through its buildings, including bund walls, raised doors, elevated machinery, and so on, in order to reduce, direct damage as a result of the flood. And then, of course, installing real-time weather monitoring systems to anticipate future risks. So we're really embracing the uncontrollable things like the weather, and have been able to track and monitor it, and also understand how climate change could have a real and lasting impact on these things too. All right. So that was, in a nutshell, the sort of how disaster risk reduction can really be fleshed out in these three spheres that private sector operates in. And I hope it helped to understand the role that private sector plays in risk reduction. I suppose the next question, though, is like, why should private sector care about disaster risk reduction? And I think that has sort of been answered in what I've presented, I hope. But basically, obviously, number one is the organization wants to safeguard its own interests and continuity. That's critical. But also needs to contribute to societal resilience. I think more and more now I think private sector has been held accountable for its own footprint, its own impact on society, and the responsibility it should take in giving back to society. And this is really a really interesting space where private sector can start to, whether it's through CSI or whatever the case may be, directly influencing societal resilience by investing in disaster risk reduction. Because in doing so, it'll obviously boost positive public perception and goodwill. It will improve the rapport with the public sector. So especially if you're an organization that's reliant on a growing customer base, this would be obviously great, because not only are you giving off a good public perception, but you're also building the resilience of your customer base, which means they're more able to engage with your product or forward your product, for example, as some examples. And then, of course, also align more closely with industry standards and best practices, which are becoming more and more a critical issue, which a lot of industries are starting to have to become more compliant with, especially with the advent of the Sustainable Development Goals, ESG, and the likes. All right, so I'm going to end off my presentation by sharing some examples where my organization has had the privilege and opportunity to work within the private sector to enhance societal resilience. So there are 3 case studies. I'll go through them fairly briefly, but I'm happy to take questions at the end if there are any. So the first one was around financial and technical support provided by the private sector. So basically, this was through a collaboration with the Department of Economic Development and Tourism here in the Western Cape, ourselves, and other tourist companies within the area, which basically acknowledge the fact that SMMEs, small, micro, and medium enterprises within the tourism industry, play a massive role in the South African economy. But they were some of the most vulnerable entities when it comes to the impact of disasters, and often because they just don't have the financial resources to protect themselves, they don't have enough skills, or have low levels of education, and just also don't have the time to put plans in place for disaster risk reduction. So through our collaboration, we were able to support risk reduction amongst SMMEs to ensure business and supply chain continuity by developing a disaster preparedness and response guideline for SMMEs. And then once this was shared, we then asked SMMEs to voluntarily attend training to be able to assist them to use and apply the guideline to ensure that they are better prepared for the disasters they face. So one of the critical things, and I think this extends not beyond the tourist sector, is the fact that a lot of companies aren't aware of the priority risks within their location or within their footprint. So if you're a company located in a specific area, it's good to understand and know, like for example, in South Africa, that there's a disaster management center within your space that is responsible for developing and maintaining a disaster risk profile. So it would be in that company's best interest to become familiar with those stakeholders and what they're doing, so that they can have access to that information, which will obviously influence their planning. So, being able to understand what priority hazards your company can directly and indirectly be affected by is critical. It's part of the first step of planning for potential disaster events. The second case study is around public-private partnerships. So I already alluded to this project earlier on in the webinar, where we partnered with the mining industry. So the mining industry have got to be, especially those that house tailings dams on their sites, have to comply with your global industry for tailings dam standards. So, and this includes engaging with or collaborating and engaging with not only communities, but also local authorities, so government and traditional leaders, to co-create and co-develop emergency management plans so as to ensure that communities are well equipped to be able to get out of harm's way should an emergency occur that was as a result of the mine. Now, this was such an incredible project for us because we were able to leverage the resources provided by the private sector to empower communities within that space to not only anticipate the disasters that emanate from the mine, but also potential disasters that could come from the community themselves. It also provided government an opportunity to reflect internally what their gaps were in terms of processes, equipment, knowledge, and so on. So we were also able to, through the assistance from the private sector, develop a capacity development plan for government to assist them to better develop disaster management plans and so on. And that was critical because what that meant is that the more empowered with resources and capabilities government became in the process, the less communities then became reliant on the industry for assistance. So it was really a quid pro quo scenario, and it was a great effort by everybody and a superb example of public-private partnerships, and how the industry could play a critical role in enhancing societal resilience in that regard. The last one is around CSR and community engagement. So this is within South Africa, one of the biggest gaps we've found here is communities are not empowered to engage with disaster risk management. They're reliant on government, and government itself is very much, we already said, it is operating within a severely resource constrained environment. So we basically developed a program that would assist in developing and establishing community risk management within communities so that they are better able to establish their own risk profiles, start engaging with and planning and implementing their own disaster risk reduction planning, and also being first responders in case of a disaster. Now, this whole process really relied very much on what we call the secondary mandate of this project, which was to identify a blended funding stream that would make community risk management within this space sustainable. And that's where the private sector really came to the table in assisting in creating revenue streams to ensure the sustainability. So, for example, establishing a community affinity program or rewards program where communities would for example, pay 17 Rand, 99 Rand for a service that provides them with thousands of rands of benefits from retail stores in the area. But for every 17 Rand that they pay per month, 3 Rand basically goes back into community risk management. So this means that not only is there now a recurring revenue stream for community risk management, but you're also getting community members to essentially invest in their own risk reduction. But this could not be done without the support of the private sector. Given the value add products and services that they could bring to the community level that could generate these income streams to make community risk management a viable entity, which would work closely with government to ensure risk reduction within that space, but would also work closely with the private sector to ensure communities are protected, customer bases are protected, employees are protected through proper disaster risk reduction. All right, so yeah, that is basically everything I wanted to share with you today. I have not been keeping track of time. Andrew and Duncan, I'm assuming you would have come in at some point to tell me I was over time. But yeah, I think that. I just wanted to say thank you so much for allowing me to share our thoughts and our understanding and the outcomes of our research, and very importantly also some of the projects that we've been involved in. And we hope to share more of the progress of those, hopefully in future webinars as well. But yeah, thank you very much. I hope I covered everything.
Hi, Frances. No, that was fantastic. No, absolutely no. Yeah, it was great timekeeping. Very fulsome presentation, and I think a lot of great food for thought, and obviously also great that the Mentimeter seemed to work, and that you're also able to get some of that engagement, throughout your presentation. I've been keeping an eye over the chat and also the Q&A. And for those that have perhaps not attended kind of national consortium type webinar in the past, we do like people, if possible, to raise their hands. You will notice that in terms of the questions, you will notice that your microphones and your cameras are currently off. And so if you have a burning question and you'd like to be able to verbalize that question yourself, on camera and on mic, then please raise your hand and then we can enable you. But Frances, I wonder, we do have a number of questions already that I will maybe kind of start with as people begin to raise their hands. But the first one that came into the chat that I'll add is from Dan. And Dan is asking a question around kind of business focus being on kind of immediate profits, while resilience is clearly kind of a long-term and that requires sustained investment over time. Do you have any experience in terms of handling that kind of mismatch between, the short-term profit orientation, but also then that long-term requirement for resilience building? And how has that been handled in any instances that you might have that you might be aware of?
Sure. I think from two perspectives, what I can say is that I'm finding that your industry players, like I said, the mining sector, the power sector, and all of those are striking a balance. They're learning to strike a balance, and I think largely because of international industry standards and frameworks that are being pushed out to enforce compliance. So they really are forcing industry to not only focus on their bottom line and their profit margins, but are really starting to force them, I don't want to use the word compel them to start engaging with your longer term resilience planning and so on, not just for the organization but the area in which they're located. So I definitely am seeing that more in your industry space, but less so, I think. Oh, okay. Also, I would also say, for example, in a retail space, we're starting to see that, especially within your grocery chains. I think when we've seen, like, for example, with COVID-19 here in South Africa, we had some significant drought events, for example, and even some of the flood events had huge impacts on the food supply chain, which then obviously had big impacts on our big grocery chains. So that has also really compelled them to start looking at how they can enhance resilience across their value chain and protecting all the way down to the farmer and ensuring protection there and building resilience and so on. So, and I think we see it less. So obviously, I keep saying it amongst the SMMEs for obvious reasons. They're just we talk about them being stuck in a reactive loop. They're so busy focusing on trying to make money and survive, that and all they can do is put out fires, and respond to incidents that impact on their business, but they are really not well equipped to think long term, to think resilience and so on. So yeah, I hope that has answered the question somewhat.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And I see more questions coming in, but I would encourage anyone who would maybe like to ask their own question to just raise their hand. But we do have questions coming into the Q&A, which I think you should be able to see, Francis, as well. But I'll just picking up on one from Ahmed Mohammed around I guess the importance of early warning systems, playing a critical role, but then in terms of thinking about predictability as well, or I guess it's about thinking towards the future and contingency plans. Are you able to then integrate that kind of predictability in the kind of work you've been doing into your kind of early preparedness? So I guess it's drawing out lessons and integrating that learning in.
Yeah, I mean, so what we're doing, we did actually, funny enough, it's totally separate. We did a study here in South Africa about understanding the various sets of legislation that exist to manage the priority hazards and risks that occur in South Africa. Now, having this now at our disposal and better understanding these sets of legislation, whenever we do engage with the private sector, we encourage them to familiarize themselves with the space so that they can understand, when we're talking about food security or flooding or fire, whose mandate is it to manage that risk, because therein you would be able to start to be able to access information you need for your own planning purposes, whether it be understanding who the early warning custodians are, who are your early warning authorities on weather, on food, on sinkholes, earthquakes, whatever the case may be, so that you can tap into that conversation or engage with those stakeholders so that you can subscribe to those early warning messages that get communicated. And then also, again, like I mentioned in my webinar, in my address, was about understanding who's responsible for doing what, so that you can integrate them into your contingency and response plan. But also, very importantly, is understanding where the gaps are, because I think for private sector, there's often an over-reliance on the public sector to do A, B, and C. But then when the disaster happens or strikes, there are major gaps and there's major fallout. And then sometimes the eye gets pointed to the private sector, say, why didn't you do more? What could you have done better? And so on, because everybody knows in many circumstances that the government can't do it. So why didn't the private sector anticipate this early on? So that brings really the question about, the importance of that public-private participation early on, preemptively, understanding the gaps, understanding where you can fill those gaps, what role you can play, and then build that into your contingency planning, response recovery, and so on. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And we're also getting some sort of questions into the chat as well. And there's one question from Varda. Apologies for pronunciation of names. And this is really around Varda's from Somaliland and asking about the kind of the education sector. But specifically, and I guess there will be, potentially transferable kind of lessons in general in relation to disaster risk reduction and schools. But engaging private sector with the education sector in terms of disaster risk reduction, and then especially around making schools, safer. Do you have any experience in terms of the kind of projects that you've been involved in or aware of?
So There in South Africa, particularly, I must say that's where the public sector actually plays a big role. I mean, they do partner with the private sector to help fund these kind of initiatives, I guess. But we've got a fantastic disaster management structure, and even if it is not well resourced, but they do prioritize education, disaster management, education and awareness among schools, because kids have the greatest voice and influence at the household level, particularly. So there's a lot of, seasonal, like your winter awareness campaigns and summer awareness campaigns when it comes to fires and floods that are fairly well practiced. There is a huge drive to build disaster management into the school curricula. And that's still got some way to go, but it certainly has been on the agenda for some time. I'm not sure what the blockages are there, but the discussion is there. And then the one project that we've been involved in and we've seen roll out is school-based early warning systems, which was fantastic, where we use the school as the central hub, and knowing through the school governing body, being able to have the early warning system come from disaster management authorities, come to the the governing body, who then sends that message to the parents, and then the parents send it out to the community. And so it has this sort of escalating effect. And that has been done very successfully in one of our provinces. So yeah, that's some of the examples, I guess, of the type of things we've done in schools.
That's fantastic, Frances. And both in terms of yourself, but also, I'm aware that there's so many people on the call from different countries, and please feel free within the chat to share, links to, to case studies or particular resources that may help to answer other people's questions and other people's comments within the chat, so that we have this kind of interactivity, so that we're not just drawing on Frances's knowledge, but kind of your collective knowledge, across the webinar. There are a couple of kind of questions in the Q&A, Frances, kind of around metrics, but one which I'll just pick up on. Obviously we talked about that profit motive, which I guess is a relatively simple metric in terms of private sector. But what kind of metrics would the private sector use, in your experience, in relation to the success of these kind of disaster risk reduction initiatives? Are there any that would be kind of go-to, or is it more, a whole pot of metrics that they would use? So any kind of insights on that would be great.
Yeah, I would probably call it a pot of metrics. And also, look, the full disclaimer, I already indicated that the bulk of my experience has been with the public sector. So I'm actually very familiar with public sector metrics, and I'm only starting to really better understand, the ones in the private sector. The ones I'm being directly exposed to, obviously, as I said, within the mining industry, metrics based on requirements set out by international standards, where through it's largely done through very basic things like, sending out surveys, following engagements to find out to what extent people have understood whatever the awareness campaign might be. Within the mining industry also, like, for example, we facilitated live community drills for tailings dam failure, and so just also like the number of people that attended and knew what to do and how to get to the assembly point, and so on and so on. So there's that basic stuff. But there's also ones that you can link with existing ones within disaster risk reduction in the public sector. I think there's a great opportunity for crossover and linkage. So we work with a great tool called the risk quartile matrix, which quantifies risk essentially, and then has this wonderful visual display of whether the risk is a low, medium, or high priority risk, how it should be managed. And then after some time, after you've implemented the risk reduction measure, you go back and you go and tweak the figures again, and you see, has your risk indicator moved up, down, sideways, or whatever, because that indicates, and I'm certain there are similar ones that gets used in the private sector, but those are the ones I'm familiar with when it comes to the public sector and how they track how well risk reduction. But I must say, in terms of risk reduction, it's not a very in terms of monitoring and evaluation, I would say, particularly in South Africa, it's not done the way it should be. It's very much how many people attended,
Yes.
type of thing. It's not meaningful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not getting into the substance
Yeah.
of the matter. Well, thank you. I just see some people then in chat adding some resources. So thanks, Alex Cameron Smith, in terms
Brilliant.
of links to resources for specifically in relation to businesses. And I see some more then just being added. There is another question that's interesting. I think that is alluding, I guess, both to your experience in terms of public sector, but equally then obviously then this private sector approach and perspective. So this is from Blue Peers Praxis. So alluding to a kind of a narrative that the private sector may be reliant on government programs, whereas obviously we're coming at it from, in terms of the webinar, from the different angle. And the question is really then, how does the private sector begin to change this kind of narrative of, I guess, reliance on government? So I guess there's various things that you've already mentioned within the webinar, but if there was maybe some that you would maybe like to kind of draw to the fore about how does that narrative change?
It's an interesting one because, within the South African context, it's certainly not that way inclined. The private sector certainly does not, unless you're a small, micro, medium enterprise, it certainly does not rely on the government. Look, okay, I mean, I suppose in terms of provision of basic services and power and water and sanitation and things like that, certainly, it's just reliant on government programs. And it's a tricky space for the private sector to be playing in because of issues around accountability and trust and so on. So, for example, as much as the private sector wants to work with government to ensure better service delivery, private sector does not want to also give money directly to government because there's a lot of problems associated there around corruption and this, that, and whatnot. But I think with this type of talking about the private sector relying on government and looking at changing the narrative to the private sector becoming less reliant. I think is that the question? Becoming less reliant on government and taking a bigger role in disaster risk reduction. The thing is also there's also a risk there around dependency that gets created, and I think that's certainly something we're seeing here in South Africa, where especially the government, not only the government but the communities themselves, become dependent on the private sector taking on more of a role on disaster risk reduction. So there's also a risk there that the private sector needs to take heed of, because you also don't want to be finding yourself in that untenable situation, because you can become very unpopular very quickly. But yeah, it's something I would have to give a little bit more thought to because it's not a perspective I'm familiar with.
No,
that makes sense. Yeah.
No, that's fantastic, Francis. And I guess part of that challenge then is, if there's in terms of reliance, is I guess, if there's a particularly dominant, industry player in one particular locality and should, for whatever reason, that company, not be able to continue in the same way, that then obviously that reliance becomes I guess, yeah. So I guess a bit of a risk factor. I think there's lots in the chat. There's lots in the Q&A as well. We obviously are conscious of time, and unfortunately we won't be able to get to everyone. But yeah, there's also then lots of I guess praise towards your presentation as well, Francis, which is really great that you covered a lot of the bases and obviously sparked a lot of thoughts and conversations. I will just see if I can share just as we come towards the end to share my slides. But if there's anyone who maybe wants to raise a hand for a final question, then this is your opportunity. But I will just see if I can share some final concluding slides. Hopefully the right ones, Duncan. So it should be sharing now. It's just to give a hopefully a sense of the geography of people that have been on the webinar. But then also in relation to, sorry, Duncan, this is the wrong one, has the wrong slides have come up on my screen. So Duncan, if you were maybe able to share the slides that you've sent me by email. So
Sure.
We have really fantastic attendance at the webinar. So we're just going to show kind of the location of all of the people that are here. But if there's any final questions that people maybe have, then please raise your hand. I'm conscious of it not just being kind of Francis and myself and Duncan's voices, but this is your last opportunity in the last number of minutes. But you can see then in relation to the INCSR logos that you can see, the yellow logos are where our various kind of colleagues who are involved with INCSR, where they're located. And then all of the purple ones, Duncan, if I'm correct, are where all of you who have been on this webinar are from. So obviously we have a pretty good distribution. Time zones will obviously be a significant factor in terms of where people are located for the various webinars that we will have not only today, but in the future. But clearly, I think we've got a pretty strong representation across several continents. Duncan, is there anything, Duncan, that you'd like to add to that?
It's thanks, Andrew. Yeah, the purple dots are just where people who have put their locations in the chat are from. So of course there'll be other people from other countries. Feel free to put them in the chat and we can update this, but it's just whoever's in the chat, that's where I've taken them from.
So thank you very much. And you can see obviously then the email address again at the bottom of the slide. So if if you'd like to get in touch, please do so. Duncan, if you could maybe move on to the next slide, and then this is just, I guess, a bit of a reiteration of some events and how to connect with us. Webinar recordings will be made available. So I've placed in the chat a number of times today where you can find that recording. So today's webinar, hopefully by the end of this week, will be available. But you can equally go on to the web page that you see there and just scroll down the screen when you're on that web page, and you will see then Societal Resilience webinars. As Duncan mentioned at the very beginning, we do have the conference in February of 2026 in Manchester. So it's a 2-day in-person conference. We are beginning now to kind of start to bring the program together, but bookings are open, and so very welcome to attend, and we'd love to see more folk attending from internationally and outside of the UK. You can connect with us on LinkedIn, and then you can check out the partner web pages for today's webinar series. So obviously the National Consortium for Societal Resilience in the UK context, then very much partnering with the International Consortium, but equally our colleagues in the RBOC network have also been very instrumental over the last number of years in terms of our webinar series. So please check out their website below. I think it really now is just a thanking Francis for obviously taking the time in preparing for today. Obviously, we did see you in Manchester in March as well, so you came all of that way and presented at our conference then. So it's great that you're able to share your knowledge and experience again via our webinar format. So it was really a fantastic presentation. It has generated a lot of activity within the chat and on the Q&A, and obviously we had a really great attendance as well. So yeah, if everyone could just thank Francis by thumbs up and thank yous, etc., that would be fantastic.